Hello and welcome everybody to this webinar. My name is Jaime Alves and I'm the Senior Education Manager for the ASP EMEA region. It's my big pleasure to continue today with this session of webinars. This is the third series of ASP Summit program featuring 6 webinars on the topic circular economy and in a circular economy in the medical device reprocessing, a roadmap for new solutions. So before we get introduced to our moderator and host for today, I would like to share with you some housekeeping tips and rules for you get a better experience in our webinar. Before we jump, don't forget that the upcoming one, it will be in October 27 and also November 24th. We have another great one about healthcare technology assessment in the circular economy. So stay tuned, join us in the following ones, and in Jan we will do our already used roundtable with all the speakers where you will have another chance to put your questions on. So moving on, as I was telling before, first make sure you switch off any non-essential applications on your device, which may be taking away from you your internet bandwidth, like the Outlook or your browse windows, for example. And if by any chance you face any disturbance and with sound or video, please refresh your browser window and close it and log in again to make it work. Today's webinar will take approximately 35 minutes, and we will have a Q&A session of 15 minutes following it. And we will conclude the webinar with our key takeaways messages, and we will introduce you to the next webinar speaker and topic. This webinar will finish in 1 hour to respect everybody's agenda. So if you have any questions for the presenter, that are not answered during the question, please make sure you put them and type them on the chat box on the right of your screen. If you are with PC, with a mobile device, you should have it on the bottom part of your screen. In order to make the presentation part of this webinar more interactive, we will have several live polls during the session for you engage yourself with the presenter questions. Please use the few seconds provided to vote in order to engage and to get also your knowledge about those questions and share it with us. One last point, this webinar will be recorded, so the link with the replay will be sent to all registrants after the webinar. And it's now my big pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Carlos Paulos. That is also our scientific director for this ASP Summit CME webinar third series. Those that have joined previous webinars already know him. So Dr. Carlos, welcome again to our ASP Summit and to this third series. Thanks for joining us today, and I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you. Thank you all of you that are attending this live webinar. So it's my pleasure to be here again with you after the summertime in Europe. And so for today, we have the characterization of the attendees, which is mainly regarding colleagues that are working on the sterilization services and departments. And also, as usual, most of you are from the Middle East and also from Europe. And in this case, we have mostly from Italy, Portugal, and UK. And most of you are have more, at least 10 years of experience. So for today, it is my pleasure to announce Dr. Victoria McCrenner, which has a master in health policy planning and financing, and she has a PhD in health economics. As you can see, Professor Victoria McCrenner has a huge experience in health service research. She is an expertise in cost effectiveness analysis and health economic modeling. She is also an international person with experience in the UK and Australia, and she is also a scientific publisher, and also she won several awards on the last years. So it is my big pleasure to take the presentation to you in Australia. Professor Victoria, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlos and James, for the very generous introduction. I will share my screen now. Okay, thanks very much, everyone, for the opportunity to speak. Before I start, as we do in Australia, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that I'm presenting from today. So those are the Awabakal and Warami people. And so I acknowledge their elders, past and present, and pay my respects to them. Okay, great. So I will now change slides. Is that going to work? No. Hold on, I might have to stop sharing and start again because the slide won't change now. Oh, hold on, here we go. Great. Okay, before we get started, I thought it would be good to get an idea of how much you know about health economics. So you should be seeing a poll coming up. So you have several options to choose from. So I know the words health and economics, but not really how they work together. I've heard of health economic evaluation, but I don't know much about the details. I've read about cost effectiveness analysis, and I know the basics, or a lot. I'm a health economist. I'll just give you a little bit more time to complete that. Okay, so still some people answering. I'll wait for a few more. Okay, let's stop it there, and we'll have a look at the responses. So, oh, looks like we've got one other health economist in the webinar, so that'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. Otherwise, it looks like most people have heard about health economics, but don't have a lot of experience. So that's probably good. Hopefully, we'll learn a lot today. Okay, so there we go. I'll talk, just go through what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I'll give you an introduction to health economic evaluation, just to sort of set the scene a bit. And then I will go through the factors that relate to sterilization of the sterilizer itself that are relevant to economic evaluation. And then I will talk a little bit about factors related to the types of instruments you might be using in your context that are relevant to evaluation. And then at the end, we'll bring it all together and show you how you might go about evaluating different types of sterilization systems in your context. And all of this will include issues that relate to the environment as well. So carbon footprint as well. Right, so let's get started with an introduction to health economic evaluation. So often one of the questions that is asked about when I talk to people about health economics who aren't familiar with it is sort of why don't we just use the best or the cheapest option depending on what your conditions are in your context. But health economics really allows us to use both of those things. So looking at both the effectiveness and the costs of different treatments and health services, and give us a bigger picture, a better idea of the complete picture of a different healthcare service or technology that you might be interested in purchasing or investing in your environment. So I guess one of the key points is that what you see up front might only be part of the story. So what's the cheapest or what's the best, the most effective? That's only looking at one aspect, and health economic evaluation allows us to look at multiple different aspects at the same time. when we're trying to make a decision about investment in a new technology or service. So a bit more of the background of why this is an important thing to do. So this graph shows you the current spending on health versus the gross domestic product of the OECD countries. So you can see here the average OECD average is about 8.8% of GDP spent on health. And you can see there's quite a range here of countries of spending. And there's one big outlier up here, which is the United States. And they're currently spending about over 16% of GDP on health. But unfortunately for them, that doesn't necessarily result in better health outcomes. And health economics is something that can help us be more efficient with our use of our usually taxpayer dollars. And what's also important about this is that the more that we spend on healthcare, the less we can spend on other things that are important to our society, such as education, roads, and other infrastructure. So again, while we could just continue spending more if we wanted to, we will eventually end up in a position where we actually can't spend anymore because we need that money to do other things that are important to our society. So this slide just really makes a point of this and says, so this is a quote that I found in a paper that I was reading when I was doing my PhD. And it's actually from 1990, so quite old now. But said, considering resource costs and cost effectiveness of medical care is both unfamiliar and troubling to clinicians. We traditionally have been able to do our best for patients while third-party payers subsidized our professionalism. In a world of limited resources, however, refusing to consider costs abdicates our responsibility to our patients and leaves the establishment of policy and regulation that increasingly guide every doctor-patient encounter to non-combatants, which really is saying we're now in a position that we need to start thinking about limited resources. And part of this is related to the increasing cost of new technologies. We need to start thinking about how to best spend our money so that we don't, by spending more money on one patient, end up in a position where we're unable to provide care for another patient. So this is something that clinicians also need to take on board, because otherwise policies and about healthcare spending will be left to people who perhaps are not on the ground clinicians. So it's important for everybody to be thinking about these things together. Okay, so next poll. Which statement would you agree with most? Health outcomes are the most important. Costs shouldn't be considered when it comes to people's health. Healthcare today is very expensive, so understanding the costs is essential. We can only invest in new technology if it saves costs, or it's a balance. Just because something improves outcomes doesn't mean we can afford to pay for it. Okay, I'll just give you a little bit more time. We'll wait till a few more people have had it. It's a bit of a tricky one. Give people a bit more time to think about it. Okay, I think we can end that one now. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so it's a pretty even split, actually. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people, so about 25% of people said that health outcomes are the most important and that we shouldn't consider costs. About a third of people that we can only invest in new technology if it saves costs, and that actually is the situation for a lot of countries now and a lot of health services. And 42%, it's a balance. So I think that's generally what it comes down to in a lot of health evaluation. It is a balance, but often it can come down to saving costs. It really depends on your particular context. Okay, I'll close that now, and we can move on to the next. Oh. Okay, so when I was so on the first slide, I think I mentioned that it's important to look beyond one particular measure of an outcome, and what you see up front might only be part of the story. So this is a graph that I created when I was doing my PhD, again to demonstrate this point. So this is a graph that plots quality of life against time in years, and we have two different treatment options. Treatment 1 in purple, and so if we graph the person's quality of life over time, we can see that they are pretty steady, and then they kind of have a low quality of life, and then after 10 years they that's the extended life that they get from this particular treatment. And the same thing happens with treatment 2. Both of these treatments allow the person to live for 10 years. So if we only looked at just that outcome, length of life, we would be missing what we can see here with treatment 2, is that while it still only allows the person to live for an additional 10 years, the person is in has a better quality of life for most of the time. And so we would be missing all of this really important information about the quality of that person's life over those 10 years if we only looked at length of life. So this is really just an important thing to take in to consider, is that what you see up front is maybe not the whole story. Okay, so move on. So I think you might have guessed that the key factors in health economic evaluation are taking into account the benefits of each option, the costs related to each of the options. The other thing that you need to take into account is an appropriate time frame. So there's not a time frame that's specific to health economic evaluation. That will depend on your context, but it also allows you to take into account uncertainty in any of your estimates that you might have of the benefits of each option or the costs of each option, for example. So as you might have also guessed, a lot of it is about balance and weighing up the various pros and cons of different options that are available to you. So how does this fit into the world of reprocessing and sterilization? Well, as you saw in the video at the beginning, reuse of medical devices is a really important environmental consideration for the healthcare industry, because we know that healthcare does create a lot of waste, and there are ways that we can try to reduce that. And the considerations for reprocessing and sterilization go beyond what is the upfront cost of the sterilization system, or the options of sterilizers that you might have. And the two key things are related to the sterilizer itself and how that works, and the instruments that you're using in your setting. So let's move on to the sterilizer factors and what is relevant to economic evaluation. So a key element will be the upfront cost of the sterilizer, the capacity of the sterilizer, so how big how many instruments can fit in one cycle, the reprocessing time, so how long it is before you can reuse your instruments. That may or may not be very important in your context. The instruments that you're using in your context, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. And there may be other factors that are context specific, such as consumables and validation requirements in your context or for the particular sterilizer system that you're using. Okay, so poll number 3. Which factors are the most important to you when thinking about the costs of reprocessing medical devices? So the upfront costs of the sterilizer, the running costs, so how much energy, water, maintenance, validation, those kind of things, the costs of consumables, or the effect on equipment, so avoiding the need for repairs or replacement? Okay. Oh, and for this one, you can choose your top two if you have more than one of these. That's important. Okay, wait for a few more. Okay, great. We might end that one there. Okay, so it looks like quite a split across, but probably the most important is the effect on the equipment, so avoiding the need for replacement and repairs. Okay, that's interesting, because I'll talk to you a bit more about that in the next section. So hopefully that'll be useful to you. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Oh, hold on. Yeah, okay. There's a bit of a delay at my end. Okay, so when we're talking about when we're thinking about the carbon footprint of the different sterilizers, the two key systems that you might be looking at, or the two different types of sterilization, would be steam, which is your sort of more traditional autoclave, and then a low temperature solution. It would usually be the alternative. So we know that steam sterilizers use a lot of energy, and they also use a lot of water, and then and steam as well. And because of that, they can do damage to some instruments. So there are, and I'll talk a little bit more about the effect in the next few slides. And then the low temperature solution has generally a much lower energy consumption, and doesn't use any water. But from a carbon footprint perspective, it's important to take into account the plastic cartridges and consumables that are used in low temperature sterilizers, also the sterilant, there's also a reduced effect of damage to instruments. So I'll talk a little bit more about how to take all of that into account. And the other important thing to think about is the carbon footprint of the consumables, the impact of the production, the impact of the waste from disposable products that might be used for indicators and testing, and then also the choice of wraps and pouches that you might be using, and trays that the devices are put in to be sterilized, and whether those are reusable or disposable. The other thing to take into account is the chemical production and disposal, for example, of the sterilant cartridges. So I won't go into a lot of detail about what the carbon footprint is of those, because that's not my area of expertise, but they are definitely things that need to be considered, and may be context specific as well. So I think everybody is aware that the costs of electricity and water have increased dramatically, particularly in the last year or so. And I know that that's becoming quite a big problem in Europe. It's also a problem as far away as Australia. We're also affected by increasing costs of electricity and gas, for example, that is related to supply issues because of the war. So that can then become quite an important factor in your decision-making process, because as you can see here, the increase in prices in most countries in Europe is just phenomenal. And so now, has a much larger impact on the budget when thinking about electricity use. There's a similar issue with water, which has also increased substantially in cost in many places. And there are, as you know, also issues related to drought, particularly in Europe presently, and some issues with supply. And that's also something that we experience frequently in Australia, although we're having the opposite problem at the moment. We have been in periods of drought before where there were issues issues of restrictions, water restrictions, as an important consideration to conserve water for the population. So I've found some case studies that looked at the water and energy consumption of steam sterilizing, and these were actually conducted in a hospital in Melbourne. And what they did was look at the energy consumption over almost a year, so 304 days, looked at how often the machines were actually in use. They looked at the average type of cycle that was used and the average load. So there were over 2,000 active cycles, and about 1,300 of those were at the 134 degrees, with an average load of 21.2 kilos. And what they found was with during the active cycles, the electricity consumption was about 60% of the total energy consumption of those machines over the 304 days. And the water consumption, similarly, was about 79% of the total water and energy consumption of those machines over the total 304 days, which meant that when the sterilizers were on standby, the electricity consumption just when they were on standby accounted for about 40% of the total consumption. And similarly, the water then, 21% of the water usage of these sterilizers was attributable just to those machines being on standby mode. So this research team found that they could potentially save a lot of energy and electricity and water if perhaps they figured out a way of not having the sterilizers on standby for so long. And so they did a study where they tried to reduce the idle time of the sterilizers, and they found that 2 or more out of the 4 steam sterilizers that they had on site, if they were idle for about 69% of the time, and if they switched off the sterilizers while they were idle, they could reduce the electricity use by 26% and their water use by 13% per year. And that equated to savings of over 13,000 Australian dollars in 2015. So that was equivalent to about over £6,000. But importantly, they found they were able to reduce the carbon emissions by 72 tonnes per year. So if this is something that could be put in place in contexts that already have steam sterilizers, for example, trying to reduce the idle time could have a substantial impact on the energy and water use, and of course the costs associated with those. So if this is something that is relevant to your context, it's definitely worth investigating whether that's a potential solution to reduce energy use and water use, importantly. So a case study also of low temperature sterilization. So I sort of alluded to before that, so this is a study of hydrogen peroxide gas plasma sterilizers, that they do have higher consumable costs, and also the sterilant cost itself. So those, you can see those prices there. And also higher testing costs that are associated sort of per day with those devices. So while you have those additional costs for the consumable type things, it's important to note that the electricity usage for these devices is substantially lower. So over 3 different models, it ranged anywhere from 10 kilowatt hours to 3.7 kilowatt hours. That so this is for one that used 8.4 square meters per day. But a similar steam sterilizer, similar sized steam sterilizer, would use probably upwards of 3 times as much energy. And of course, there's water associated with the use of steam sterilizers. And hydrogen peroxide gas plasma sterilizers don't use any water. So while you have this higher cost of consumables, it's potentially you can trade that off against the electricity and water usage that you would be reducing by using a low temperature sterilizer. Okay, so moving on to the instrument factors that are relevant to the evaluation. The first thing that you probably would need to consider are context specific. So what types of instruments are you using? Because if they're made of plastics, or you've got electrical devices or corrosion susceptible metal alloys, those things are affected by high temperature and high humidity. And so then they may be damaged in a steam sterilizer, for example. From the perspective of carbon footprint and cost, things like the frequency of repairs, the need to have spare equipment in case of damage, the need for replacement if there's substantial damage, and also the degradation in some devices that may have an impact on quality, but perhaps isn't so bad that it needs repair. There's a carbon footprint associated with each of these things, which relates to the actual repairing or replacing. So each new part, each new repair also has a carbon footprint element associated with it. And while I'm not going to talk about how that's actually able to be calculated, those are important things to take into account. I can talk to you about the costs and the reduction in repairs that you might see from changing, if you have those types of devices, from changing to steam to a low temperature system. So this is taken from a paper, and you can see the reference in the slide there, where in a hospital in Germany, I think I might have that wrong, was using a steam sterilizing system and moved to a low temperature system. And what they did was record all of the different types of damage that occurred, and how frequently that happened, and the types of damage. And then when they changed over, they recorded the same thing for using a low temperature sterilization system. And they found that the total number of repairs reduced by 33%. However, if we looked at the total number of procedures carried out in the steam system versus the low temperature system, we found an even greater difference, which was, so they reduced by 58% the number of repairs. If you looked at, essentially this is repairs per procedure. So this is a proxy for the number of times each item was sterilized, so the number of sterilizations, I suppose. And interestingly, also the damage that is more frequently associated with steam, high temperature and high moisture environments, such as thermal lens damage and ocular leakage. You can see these ones have even a greater change over time. So something to definitely think about when examining these things in your context. So in terms of how much it costs to repair instruments, for a project I did a few years ago, I looked at various studies that had examined the frequency and cost of repairs to different types of endoscopes. I've inflated these all to current US prices for consistency, so we can easily compare across the different studies and the different years, and found a new one that's was just published last year. But you can see that the cost of repair, this is per repair, is getting close to $4,000, which, if it's happening frequently, can really add up. So particularly if in your context you're using a lot of endoscopes and those types of instruments, this could be quite a dramatic change in cost. Okay, so on to the last poll. Which factors are the most important to you when thinking about the carbon footprint of reprocessing medical devices? So we have, and you can choose your top two for this one as well. Energy consumption in the sterilization and reprocessing, water consumption in the sterilization and reprocessing, reducing the use of single-use items and plastics, chemicals and contamination, or effect of sterilization on devices, so damage and frequency of repairs. Okay, maybe wait a tiny bit longer. Okay. Great, I think we can end that one there. Okay, great. Well, it's quite an even split across all of them. And that's that I'm sort of glad to hear that, because I think these are actually all things that we need to keep in mind when we're evaluating what's the best option for our particular context. So that's great. I think we really need to think about energy, water, reducing single-use items, chemicals, and also how these different sterilization systems can affect medical devices. Okay, so on to the last section. Here we go. How do we use all of this information to evaluate the economics and environmental factors in your context? So I've spoken about each of the different things that we can include in our model over the last few slides. So it's actually quite a straightforward process to bring this all together. So you might have your two options. So you may have steam and low temperature, and then you might divide that into different types of important elements. So reprocessing costs. So for example, in steam, you may have some consumables. You may have a volume of water that's used per cycle, and the same, a volume of steam, and the amount of electricity that's used per cycle. And you will also have ongoing testing and maintenance. And now you may only be doing that, that may not necessarily be happening every cycle, but you're able to just divide that across cycles, or you put in into your model a monthly or a weekly, whatever the relevant frequency of testing is for your particular context. And then you also may have the instrument factors, so the probability of repairs in this particular, for a steam sterilizer, and then also the need for replacement in a steam sterilizer context. And then you would have the same type of thing for your low temperature. So you would have your reprocessing costs. So for this one, we would have electricity, consumables, including sterilant, and also testing and maintenance. But for this one, obviously, we don't have the water and steam elements. And then the instrument factors as well. So probability of repairs for low temperature and need for replacement for low temperature. And what we can do with this is run this model. So adding up all of our costs that are associated with each of these, and you could equally do that with a carbon footprint outcome if you had that available to you, and run this. So this could be per cycle, and you could potentially say, well, I run my steam sterilizer however many times a day or week or month, and then how would that compare with running a low temperature sterilizer in my context? So for example, things like the electricity cost and the cost of repairs may be the same in each, but you would have a different probability of repairs and a different amount of electricity in each of your different contexts. And so this enables you to bring everything that you have, everything that you've thought of that's important to your context. And I should note here that this isn't necessarily everything. These are the things we've talked about today, but you may have different things that you can add in. So this is not a sort of be all and end all exclusive way to set up your model. It can be quite flexible. So what you would do is look at this over time and run it for as long as it's appropriate in your context. And then you can compare the outcomes. Okay, so how much did it cost, or how many repairs did I have to do with the steam sterilizer? How much did it cost? How many repairs were there in this low temperature environment? And you can also incorporate uncertainty into any of your estimates and run the model in different ways to test how your uncertainty in estimates affects your overall outcomes. Okay, so coming back to how you evaluate this in your context. So some of the key things to think about are an appropriate time frame. It's also important to think about inflation and changing costs over time. We've talked about that in the context of changing electricity prices and also the cost of water. It's quite important to take into account uncertainty in terms of your estimate of how much something will cost or what the outcomes are, because you can incorporate that into your model. And it may have an effect on the outcome if you have a lot of uncertainty, in particular about certain elements of your model. And I guess some of the and then also what is important is that you can then compare the upfront costs, for example, if you're going to invest in new technology, and compare those against the monthly and ongoing costs of the different sterilization techniques. So you may also, within your context, have budgetary requirements that may differ for capital expenditure versus ongoing expenditure. So that's something that you would need to consider with the finance department or whoever is able to make those decisions in your context. You may also have local considerations such as renewable energy, waste disposal restrictions, or and also water. So those are other things that may be really important to your context. For example, if you are in an environment where you're able to have most of your energy generated through renewable resources, the amount of energy you're using may be less of a concern. Similarly, if you're in a place with really quite severe water restrictions, that may become a very important part of your in your context and of your evaluation decision. So I'll just quickly cover off on the things that we haven't covered today, just to reiterate that. So I haven't covered how to calculate your carbon footprint. But it is something that if you are able to calculate carbon elements of carbon footprint related to each of the elements in your model, you could calculate that. I haven't talked about which aspects of waste and carbon footprint are most important, because those are context specific, and as I alluded to before, they may depend a lot on your local waste and recycling facilities, renewable energy generation, and those types of things. And I haven't gone into a lot of detail about the carbon footprint related to replacement and repair of medical instruments, although we know that there is a carbon footprint associated with making new devices and repairing devices. So, for example, water and energy consumption associated with doing those things and creating new devices. Okay, so some key takeaway messages. I think hopefully you've taken away that it's really important to look beyond just the upfront cost of the sterilizer. So what you see up front really is only part of the story. There are large differences in energy and water consumption of different sterilization techniques or technologies, and that is becoming much more important in the current environment. There is an effect of different sterilizing processes on instruments, which is an important consideration because it does have an effect on cost and carbon footprint. Consumables and disposable items also contribute to a carbon footprint. And I hope that you've taken away that the principles of health economics can be used to evaluate decisions around reprocessing technologies in your context. So thank you very much for your time today. And if you have a list of references here, and I think we will come to questions now.
Yes, thank you very much for your comprehensive and very interesting presentation. I think we could be here for the rest of the day listening to you, and because this is very interesting, and I think you are a very good communicator, and you express very well the ideas. So thank you very much. Indeed, we have here 2 questions from the audience. The first one is if you can explain a little more about how you incorporate uncertainty into the modeling of evaluation. So it's
okay. Yes, thanks for the question. So if you think back to the model structure that I presented, so what you can do with that is have your sort of best estimate of each of the values that are associated. So your amount of energy used per cycle, for example, or amount of water used per cycle. And you run your model with that. That's your best estimate. But what you can then do is use statistical distributions or a range of values and run the model multiple times. So in a normal economic evaluation, I would do that thousands of times, and then I can look at the distribution of those thousands of runs of the model, and I can say, okay, it looks like it's mostly or it's every time I run the model is fairly close to that estimate. Or, you know, if I change the cost of electricity just a tiny bit, suddenly the costs over a year are huge. Or if it turns out that the cost of repairing an instrument, for example, is a bit lower than I thought, maybe, you know, over a year that suddenly becomes a lot less expensive than I thought, or it could go the other way. So you're able to test how sensitive your best estimates are to those differences. So that's something that's really quite easy to do once you've set up your model. Yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting because these models are very dynamic. Because of the changes, for example, as you showed on the your slide regarding the costs of electricity. So it could not be an issue some time ago, but for example, the relative weight of the energy costs now could be different. And also you mentioned the water and the problems related to the water, not only the cost, but also the availability of water, because in Europe we are running out of water, which was typically a problem of the southern countries of Europe, just like Portugal and Spain and some parts of Italy. But now the problem is extending, including to northern countries, just like, for example, the UK and some regions of Germany and so on. So we are facing some issues that, in fact, could influence the modeling and all the aspects of evaluation. And for finishing, because we are 5 minutes to the end, I have another question. How would you choose an appropriate time frame to make a model?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Thanks. So again, it can be quite context specific. So for example, your finance manager might want to know, look, I need to know how much this is going to cost over a year. However, it might be more appropriate in your context to run the model for, say, if you're particularly concerned about the impact that the sterilization technique has on instruments, you might say, look, what's the expected life of my endoscope, for example? How long would that ordinarily last for? So say they are designed to last for 10 years, then I would suggest potentially running the model for 10 years to get an understanding of how many times you might need to repair or replace, or, you know, are you going to in fact need to replace your instrument before those 10 years are up. The problem, for example, if the instrument's only designed to live to last for 2 years and you ran your model for 10 years, that might not be appropriate, because you would need to replace your instrument within that time period anyway. So you'd probably need to make some adjustments. So context specific, but those are the types of things to think about. Or you might, you know, you might want to do it based on the expected lifetime of the sterilization system itself. So those are the context specific.
Thank you. Very interesting, because in fact we cannot forget the context for each specific technique or device.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Thank you very much for the answers. I think we don't have any further questions. So thank you, Professor Victoria. I'm just going to give the words to Jaime. Thank you very much. And for my part, see you on the next webinar on next month. Thank you, Professor Victoria. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like really to give a big thanks again to Professor Victoria for her insights presentation. As Carlos mentioned, we could be listening to her all the afternoon because the topic is so interesting, and it's something also that worries everybody, or should at least. And the way you do it, you make it even more interesting to read, to listen, and to think about solutions that we can every single day in our departments, in our daily lives and work, make something to change and to protect our planet. I really hope this was also very beneficial for our audience, and I'd like also to thank to Dr. Paulus for again being with us, moderating this webinar. Our next webinar will take place, as I have mentioned before, on the October 27. We're gonna come back to the old time slot from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock Central Europe time. And we will have in this webinar, it will be around the topic of the medical device reprocessing in the circular economy, looking to the off-site sterilization versus the on-site versus the off-site. And to do that, we will have the honor to have with us Mrs. May Karen, the EORNA president, and also a governmental certified operating room nurse in a public hospital, Saint Anthony in Paris, France. So I'd like really to have you all joining. So registration will open, so stay tuned because we're gonna receive communications around it. As a reminder, for everybody, today's webinar has been recorded, and you will receive an email with a replay link. In that email, you also have a link for a short survey that we would like you to have it. It will not take more than 2 minutes to fill it, and we would love to have your opinion in order to continue to improve our webinar series. After that, you also will receive a thanks page where you will have access to download your webinar summary with the fact sheet that with all the content that Professor Victoria just shared with us, as well your attendance certificate. Thanks once again for your attendance and participation today. I wish you a lovely day, and I hope to see you soon in our next webinar.